I need you to hear this honestly, because I have never said it out loud to anyone else, not even to myself. For a long time, I thought life was something to be conquered, a series of distant horizons to be reached by sheer force of will. When I look at you now, with our wedding day finally approaching, my chest tightens from the weight of how long it took me to get here, to this exact spot beside you. I used to believe that the road beneath my feet was something I commanded, an endless strip of asphalt waiting for me to leave my mark. I thought I knew what I wanted. I thought I understood the destination. I thought I was ready. But the truth is, I was just running, fueled by an ambition so blinding that it made everything else invisible. In those early days, the dreams were loud, filling every corner of my mind until there was no room for anything quiet. I wanted to build something undeniable, something that would stand against time and prove that I existed, that I mattered. I remember sitting in empty rooms late at night, watching headlights of passing cars dance across the ceiling, convinced I was destined for something massive. There was an intoxicating illusion of control back then, a foolish certainty that if I just worked harder and sacrificed enough, I could dictate the terms of my own life. I looked at the world as a puzzle to be solved, rather than a reality to be lived. But I didn't understand that yet. I didn't see that the very things I was chasing were setting traps for the man I was supposed to become. Have you ever looked back at an old photograph of yourself and felt completely disconnected from the person staring back? That is how I feel when I remember those early miles on the road. I was so certain that my strength was defined by what I could accumulate, by the victories I could tally up in the dark. I didn't notice the quiet mornings fading away, or the way I was slowly tuning out the voices of people who actually cared about me. I was trading pieces of my humanity for a phantom success that promised to fulfill me but only left me hungrier. What if the thing you were chasing wasn't the thing you needed? I ask myself that now, looking at the cracks in the foundation I tried so desperately to build. This is the part I rarely talk about, the moments when the noise died down and the first doubts started to seep through the floorboards. I remember a specific night, parked on the shoulder of a dark highway, watching the rain streak across the windshield. The engine was idling, a low hum that felt like the only steady thing in my universe. I had just achieved something I thought would change everything. A milestone I had starved myself emotionally to reach. But as I sat there alone, the victory felt entirely hollow. It was just a cold piece of metal, a fleeting headline, a temporary distraction from the emptiness growing inside my chest. And that mistake followed me longer than I expected, the belief that the next mile, the next achievement, would finally be the one to cure the ache. Look at me when I say this, because it matters more than any story of triumph I could ever tell you. I was a man who believed he could outrun his own shadow, that if I kept moving fast enough, the loneliness wouldn't be able to catch up. I thought my independence was a shield, but it was just a wall I was building brick by brick, trapping myself inside an echo chamber of my own design. Maybe you felt something similar in your own life, that sudden, terrifying realization that you have succeeded in building a world where you are entirely alone. I didn't know you then, of course. You were a lifetime away, a possibility I hadn't earned the right to imagine. But looking back, I see it differently now. I see how every misstep, every arrogant assumption of control was slowly breaking down the armor I wore so proudly. Don't rush past this part, because the origin of the journey dictates everything that follows. I started out wanting to conquer the road, completely unaware that it was actually conquering me, stripping away my illusions until there was nothing left but the bare truth. I thought I was designing a masterpiece, but I was really just clearing the wreckage of a dream that was never big enough to hold a heart like yours. The highway stretched out ahead, dark and indifferent, and I finally shifted into drive, stepping blindly into the teeth of a storm I thought I could handle. The storm did not come all at once. It rolled in with a quiet, devastating slowness that I mistook for the normal weight of a hard day's work. This is the part of the road where the cost of ambition finally starts to demand payment, and I paid it willingly, believing that everything valuable required a piece of your soul as collateral. I moved to a bigger city, took on a larger desk, and surrounded myself with the frantic, exhausting hum of people who were just as terrified of standing still as I was. I remember the exact smell of that empty office after everyone else had left, a sterile mix of fluorescent lighting and stale coffee, where I would sit for hours staring at numbers on a screen until my eyes burned. I told myself I was building security, that I was anchoring my life to something unshakable, but in reality, I was just constructing a highly efficient cage. I thought that by controlling my environment, I could insulate myself from failure. Have you ever realized a victory cost more than you expected? That was the rhythm of my late 20s, a steady accumulation of milestones that felt less like achievements and more like heavy stones I was forced to carry. I was winning the games I chose to play, but the prizes were turning to dust the moment I touched them. I remember buying a car I couldn't really afford, driving it through the city streets at 2 in the morning with the windows down, hoping the rush of wind would make me feel alive, make me feel like the man I was pretending to be. Instead, I just felt small, a tiny speck drifting through a concrete labyrinth, entirely disconnected from the earth. I was so consumed by the friction of trying to prove my worth that I didn't notice the silence growing around me. My phone would ring, a friend asking to grab a drink, or a family member wondering when I was coming home for the holidays. And I would let it go to voicemail, muttering some lie about being too busy, too essential to the machine. This is the version of myself that I am most ashamed to show you, the man who looked at human connection as a distraction from the prize. I treated time like currency, spending it only where I thought I would get a return on my investment, completely blind to the fact that the most beautiful things in life cannot be bought or leveraged. And that mistake followed me longer than I expected, shaping the way I looked at the world for a generation. I became defensive, viewing anyone who tried to get close to me as a potential threat to my focus, a complication I didn't have the luxury to decipher. Looking back, I see it differently now. I see that my ambition wasn't a sign of strength. It was an admission of fear. I was terrified that if I paused, if I let the momentum drop for even a second, I would have to look in the mirror and face the vacuum I was creating. Stay with me, because this changed everything the moment the first real cracks began to appear in the glass house I had built. It happened during a quiet morning in early autumn, watching the seasons change through a window I rarely opened. I was holding a cup of tea, watching the steam rise and vanish into the air, when a sudden wave of exhaustion hit me so deeply it felt physical, settling into my bones like a permanent winter. It wasn't the kind of tiredness that a night of sleep could fix. It was the fatigue of a man who had been running a marathon in the wrong direction for a decade. I looked at the calendar on my desk, filled with appointments and deadlines, and for the first time in my life, I didn't care about any of them. The illusion of control simply evaporated, leaving behind a cold, sharp panic. I need you to hear this honestly. I didn't know how to stop. I had built my entire identity around the hustle, around being the guy who never broke, who always found a way through the wall. To admit that I was tired, that I was empty, felt like a form of death. Maybe you've felt something similar, that frozen moment where you realize the path you meticulously planned is leading you straight off a cliff, but your feet are moving too fast to change direction. I was trapped by my own success, a prisoner of the reputation I had manufactured. I looked out at the road ahead, and for the first time, it didn't look like an invitation. It looked like a sentence. I didn't know your name yet. I didn't know the sound of your laugh or the way you look when you're thinking deeply. But looking back at that exhausted man in the office, I realized he was finally beginning to understand that he couldn't save himself by running faster. The first cracks didn't shatter the structure. They just let the cold air in, making it impossible to stay comfortable in the life I had manufactured. I remember the exact texture of that realization, like walking through an old house and noticing the floorboards yielding beneath your weight, warning you that the foundation is rotting. I began to make mistakes, not the loud, dramatic kind that people notice immediately, but the quiet, internal errors of omission. I started forgetting why I had entered the race in the first place. I would sit in high-level meetings surrounded by men who spoke with absolute conviction about targets and growth, and I would find myself staring at the dust motes, dancing in the shafts of sunlight, wondering how we had all agreed to take this theater so seriously. I thought I knew how to play the part, but the script was beginning to feel foreign in my mouth. It was during this phase that the missed phone calls started piling up, a digital trail of the relationships I was letting slip through my fingers. I remember a specific evening standing in the kitchen of my apartment, watching a digital clock blink in the dark after a power outage. It just kept flashing 12:00 over and over, a tiny, repetitive reminder that time was standing still inside my walls while the rest of the world moved forward. My brother had called 3 times that week to tell me something important about his daughter, my niece, and each time I had texted back a polite, clinical response about being buried under a deadline. When I finally called him back on a quiet Sunday afternoon, his voice sounded different, older, more guarded, as if he had adjusted to my absence and found a way to live around it. Have you ever realized you've become a stranger to the people who used to know your heart? It is a heavy, silent kind of grief that you can't easily explain to anyone else. This is the part I rarely talk about. The way I tried to patch the cracks with even more distractions rather than stopping to examine the damage. Instead of slowing down, I bought a ticket to a country I had never visited, convincing myself that a change of scenery would fix the internal misalignment. I spent 2 weeks walking through crowded foreign markets and sitting in lonely coastal cafes, surrounded by languages I didn't speak, hoping the sheer novelty of isolation would feel like peace. But you carry yourself with you wherever you go. Every long road at night looks exactly the same when you are running from your own thoughts, whether it's an interstate in the Midwest or a winding track along the Mediterranean. I would look at old photographs on my phone, trying to trace the exact moment when the boy with the wide, honest eyes turned into the man who couldn't glass of whiskey or a spreadsheet to occupy his mind. And that mistake followed me longer than I expected. The belief that geographical distance could cure an emotional deficit. I came back to my life with a tan and the same hollow ache in my chest, realizing that the house was still shifting beneath me. Look at me when I say this, because I need you to understand the depth of my stubbornness. I still didn't ask for help. I thought that asking for help was an admission of weakness, a white flag raised to a world that only respected winners. I thought I could engineer my way out of the loneliness, just like I had engineered my way out of poverty and obscurity. What if the delay carried a purpose? What if the universe was deliberately shutting every door I tried to force open, trying to make me look down at the ground I was standing on instead of the horizon? Maybe you felt something similar, that strange, suspended animation where you know the current version of your life is ending, but you are too terrified of the dark to step into whatever comes next. I was stuck between the man I used to be and the man I was supposed to become, hanging onto the wreckage of my own ambition like a sailor afraid to swim for the shore. I would look out at the city lights from my balcony, watching the thousands of tiny glowing windows, and wonder if anyone else was standing there doing the exact same math, calculating the cost of everything they had gained against the weight of everything they had lost. I didn't know then that the breaking was necessary, that the cracks were the only way the light could eventually find its way into the room where I had hidden myself away. I was just a man watching the seasons change from a distance, waiting for a storm that had already arrived. When you can no longer stand the sight of the life you've built, you start running from the truth, using velocity as a substitute for healing. This is the stage where the road became my hiding place, a blur of gray pavement and unfamiliar horizons where I hoped the sheer speed of my movement would outrun the quiet voice in my head. I spent months living out of suitcases, bouncing between sterile hotel rooms and anonymous airport terminals, finding a strange, comforting safety in being nowhere in particular. In those rooms, with their identical curtains and generic art on the walls, I didn't have to be the successful professional, the reliable son, or the man who had his future figured out. I was just a ghost passing through, a name on a reservation slip. I thought that if I didn't drop anchor anywhere, I could never be shipwrecked. But I didn't understand that by refusing to touch the ground, I was already drowning. I remember one specific night in an airport terminal during a 3-hour delay in the dead of winter. The shops were closed, the lights were dimmed, and the only sound was the low, rhythmic hum of the ventilation system. I sat on a cold plastic chair, watching the snow blanket the tarmac outside, completely surrounded by hundreds of strangers who were all sleeping or staring into their phones. I felt an isolation so profound it felt like a physical weight pressing down on my chest, a realization that if my plane vanished into the dark that night, my absence would just be a logistical problem for a few corporate entities to solve. I had spent years decoupling my life from human dependency, and I had finally succeeded in becoming entirely irrelevant to the emotional fabric of the world. Have you ever stood in a crowded room and realized that your presence changes absolutely nothing? It is a terrifying kind of freedom. This is the part I rarely talk about, the desperate, clumsy ways I tried to numb that realization instead of facing it honestly. I began filling the silence with noise, leaving the television on in empty hotel rooms just to hear human voices, keeping the radio blasting at midnight on long stretches of highway, and engaging in shallow, meaningless conversations with strangers at hotel bars whose names I would forget before the ice in my glass melted. I was terrified of a quiet room because a quiet room meant looking at the unfinished letters in my briefcase, the ones I started writing to people I loved but could never find the courage to mail. I was a man running a fever, trying to cure it by walking out into the freezing cold. Looking back, I see it differently now. I see that the running wasn't an adventure. It was a slow motion collapse, a desperate attempt to stay ahead of the ledger of my life before the debt collectors of my conscience caught up. And that mistake followed me longer than I expected. The belief that I could find myself by completely losing my way. I thought that by stripping my life down to the bare essentials of survival and motion, I was proving my resilience. But resilience without connection is just rigidity, a brittle stance that breaks the moment the wind changes direction. Look at me when I say this, because I need you to know the exact texture of my cowardice. I was running because I was terrified of being known. I was terrified that if someone looked at me closely, past the titles, past the calculated confidence, and past the stories of hard work, they would see a frightened boy who had traded his capacity for intimacy for a handful of dust. Maybe you felt something similar, that instinct to pull your coat tight and walk faster when the world starts asking for more of you than you feel capable of giving. I didn't know your voice then. I didn't know the quiet, steadying presence you would bring into my world years later, but looking back at that long road at night, I realized every mile I put between myself and my past was just a necessary detour. I had to exhaust every possible escape route, had to run down every dead-end highway and sleep in every lonely room before I could finally understand that the only way out of the labyrinth was to stop running and face the man standing in the center of it. The running eventually stops, not because you find the courage to turn around, but because the road simply runs out of pavement. That was how I found myself facing loneliness, a deep, resonant stillness that felt less like a choice and more like a collapse. I stopped booking flights, I stopped driving into the night, and I finally forced myself to stay inside the quiet walls of my apartment for weeks at a time. I remember the absolute vulnerability of those quiet mornings, sitting on the floor with a cup of lukewarm coffee, watching the shadows of trees shift across the wall as the sun crawled across the sky. For years, I had used noise to drown out my own thoughts, but in that forced isolation, the silence became a mirror. Every mistake I had ever made, every person I had pushed away, and every compromise I had ever accepted came back to visit me in those hours. I thought I was protecting myself by keeping the world at bay, but I was really just starving. There is a distinct difference between being alone and being lonely, and I learned that distinction through the heavy, slow-moving seasons of my early 30s. Loneliness is the realization that you have built a beautiful, elaborate stage, but there is no one in the audience to watch the performance. I remember looking through an old box of photographs one evening, finding a picture of myself from a decade prior, standing with a group of friends outside a crowded diner at dawn. We were all laughing, completely broke, and entirely uncertain about the future, yet our eyes were bright with a shared heat. I looked at my current life, the high-end furniture, the secure bank account, the pristine view of the city skyline, and realized I had traded that warmth for a cold, sterile independence. Have you ever looked at your life and realized you won the war, but lost the very kingdom you were fighting to protect? This is the part I rarely talk about, the moments where the self-doubt became so heavy that it felt like it was crushing my ability to breathe. I would look at my phone, scrolling through names of people I used to share everything with. and realized the distance between us was now too vast to bridge with a casual text. I had trained them to expect my absence, and they had learned to respect it by moving on without me. I was a ghost inhabiting my own life, watching the seasons change from behind a double-paned glass window. And that mistake followed me longer than I expected, the paralyzing belief that because I had chosen isolation for so long, I was permanently broken, unfit for the delicate architecture of human intimacy. I thought the damage was done, that my heart had grown too rigid to ever bend around another person's needs again. Look at me when I say this, because this is where the perspective begins to shift from regret into something resembling wisdom. I need you to understand that facing that loneliness wasn't a punishment. It was a purgatory. It was the only way the universe could strip away the arrogance that had governed my youth. In those long, silent nights, when the city below me fell asleep and left me alone with my pulse, I started to ask different questions. I stopped asking how I could succeed, and I started asking who I was when everything else was stripped away. What if the delay carried a purpose? What if the isolation wasn't a prison, but a studio where the man I was supposed to be was being slowly, painfully chiseled out of the stone? Maybe you've felt something similar, that profound winter of the soul where you feel entirely forgotten by the world, completely disconnected from any sense of magic or hope. I didn't know your name during those silent winters. I didn't know that one day your hand would find mine on a quiet morning, just like the ones that used to terrify me. But looking back, I see the pattern. I had to learn to sit with my own emptiness before I could ever hope to appreciate the fullness of another soul. I had to learn to survive the silence so that when your voice finally arrived, I would know exactly how to listen. When you sit in the silence long enough, the static clears, and you finally begin understanding the pattern of your own destruction. For years, I believed my life was a series of random accidents. Bad timing, difficult people, or unfortunate turns of luck on a crowded highway. But in the quiet mornings after the storm had passed, I began to see the invisible thread connecting every broken relationship and every hollow victory. The common denominator in all my wreckage was me. I was the one who built the walls. I was the one who turned a deaf ear to the people who tried to anchor me. I was the one who treated vulnerable moments like vulnerabilities to be exploited or avoided. I thought I was protecting my heart, but I was really just practicing a sophisticated form of emotional cowardice. I remember a quiet evening spent sorting through a drawer of unfinished letters, documents, and old journals I had kept over the span of 15 years. Reading through my own words from different phases of my life felt like reading the diary of a stranger who kept making the same wrong turn at the exact same intersection. Every time someone got close enough to see past my armor, I would manufacture a crisis, find a flaw, or suddenly discover a deadline that required me to pack my bags and move on. I saw how I had weaponized my ambition, using my career as a perfectly valid, socially acceptable excuse to avoid the terrifying work of being known. Have you ever looked back and realized you were the villain in the stories you used to tell yourself about your own bad luck? It is a bitter pill to swallow, realizing that the cage you are trapped in was built entirely by your own hands. This is the part I rarely talk about because it requires admitting to a level of selfishness that is hard to carry gracefully. I realized that my obsession with independence wasn't a noble pursuit of freedom. It was an absolute refusal to be accountable to anyone else's pain. If I didn't love anyone completely, then I never had to worry about failing them, or worse, having them fail me. I had traded the messy, unpredictable beauty of real connection for a controlled environment where nothing could hurt me, but nothing could grow either. And that mistake followed me longer than I expected, the lingering fear that even if I recognized the pattern, I was too old, too set in my ways to break it. I worried that my default setting would always be to run whenever things became heavy or real. Look at me when I say this, because this realization is the exact pivot point where my life began to change direction. It takes an incredible amount of energy to maintain a lie, especially when the person you are lying to is yourself. The moment I stopped defending my past actions, a strange kind of peace settled into the room. I stopped trying to justify why I had left, why I had hidden, or why I had prioritized the cold metrics of success over the warmth of human touch. Looking back, I see it differently now. I see that the breakdown of my old life wasn't a tragedy. It was a rescue mission. The pattern had to be exposed, had to be laid bare on the floor in front of me before I could ever hope to choose a different path. Maybe you felt something similar, that sobering moment where you stand amidst the pieces of a life you broke yourself, wondering if it's even possible to build something new from the debris. I didn't know then that my willingness to face my own flaws was the very thing preparing me to receive you. I had to learn to look at my own darkness without flinching, so that when I finally looked into your eyes, I wouldn't feel the need to hide. I was learning to stop running from the mirror, slowly figuring out how to stand still long enough to let someone actually love the man underneath the armor. Once you understand the pattern, you stop looking at your history as a series of failures and start finding meaning in the pain. This is the stage where the road shifts from an escape route into a crucible. I began to realize that the long nights, the hollow victories, and even the suffocating walls of that empty office weren't just wasted time. They were the cost of tuition for an education I couldn't receive any other way. I had to feel the absolute coldness of a life built entirely around myself to understand why warmth matters. I had to reach the end of my own strength on that dark highway to realize that independence is a poor substitute for purpose. I thought I was just surviving a series of random collapses, but I was actually being dismantled so that I could be rebuilt from a truer blueprint. I remember watching the seasons change during a particularly quiet spring, observing how the earth didn't rush its recovery after a brutal winter. It happened in small, almost invisible increments. The way the light stayed a few minutes longer each evening, the sudden appearance of green shoots through the hard, frozen soil outside my window. I spent my mornings walking through the city without a destination, no longer checking my watch or calculating my next move. For the first time in my life, I allowed myself to just exist in the transition, to feel the discomfort of not knowing what came next without trying to fix it. Have you ever realized that the worst things you lived through were the very things that gave you a heart capable of deep empathy? If I hadn't known true isolation, I would never have developed the eyes to see it in anyone else. This is the part I rarely talk about because it sounds almost foolish to a world that values constant progress. I started to feel a strange sense of gratitude for the exact moments that used to bring me the most shame. I was grateful for the empty hotel rooms that forced me to face my own thoughts. I was grateful for the missed phone calls that taught me the fragility of neglect. I was even grateful for the profound fatigue that finally forced me to drop my weapons and surrender my need for control. And that realization followed me longer than I expected. changing the way I interacted with every person who crossed my path. I stopped trying to impress people with my resume, and instead, I started looking for the cracks in their stories because I finally knew that the cracks were where the real human being lived. Look at me when I say this because this is the lesson that earned every wrinkle around my eyes. I need you to hear this honestly. Pain is not a destination, but it is an incredible guide. It strips away everything that is superficial, leaving behind only what is durable and true. What if the delay carried a purpose? What if every lonely mile, every unfinished letter, and every moment of self-doubt was a necessary part of the alignment? I see it so clearly now. The universe wasn't punishing me by keeping me waiting in the dark. It was protecting the people I might have hurt if I had achieved my goals when I was still too arrogant to handle them. It was keeping me empty until I was mature enough to know how to properly hold a blessing. Maybe you felt something similar in your own journey, that quiet turning point where you stop asking, why did this happen to me, and start asking, what did this prepare me for? I didn't have your face in my mind during those reflective spring walks, but the space inside me was changing, opening up old doors that had been locked since I was a boy. I was finally moving past the wreckage of who I used to be, learning to trust that the road wasn't just leading me away from my mistakes. It was gently, persistently steering me toward an arrival I couldn't yet see. The shift happens quietly, almost imperceptibly, when you find yourself believing in connection again. After years of guarding your perimeter, you stop looking at other people as mirrors for your own performance or as judges of your past, and you begin to view them as travelers who might just be looking for the same light you are. I remember the first time I felt that shift, sitting on a bench in a crowded public park on a Saturday afternoon, watching families, lovers, and old friends move through the grass. For the first time in a decade, I didn't look at them with a cynical detachment or a competitive urge. I felt a soft, unfamiliar warmth in my chest, a sudden, deep desire to belong to the human fabric again, to step out of the isolation I had defended so fiercely. I thought I had trained myself to live without needing anyone, but I was finally realizing that a life lived entirely for oneself is a story not worth telling. It was during this time that I started writing letters again, but this time I actually finished them and dropped them into the mailbox. I reached out to my brother, not with a brief text about a deadline, but with an honest apology and an invitation to just talk about nothing at all. When his voice came through the line, without the old guard or the careful hesitation, I felt a heavy stone roll away from the door of my heart. I began to seek out quiet mornings with old friends, sitting in familiar coffee shops for hours without checking my phone, listening to the mundane, beautiful details of their ordinary lives. Have you ever realized that the magic you were chasing in distant cities and high-stakes victories was actually hidden in the quiet silences between people who simply refused to give up on each other? I had missed so much because I was moving too fast to notice the things that were standing still. This is the part I rarely talk about because it involves a terrifying level of vulnerability. The moment you realize you want to love again, but you are entirely out of practice. I had spent so long acting as my own anchor, my own shield, and my own island that the idea of letting someone else influence my peace felt like stepping onto a frozen lake without knowing how thick the ice was. I would lie awake at night, looking at the ceiling, wondering if I had permanently dulled my capacity for deep affection, or if the machinery of my heart had grown too rigid to ever synchronize with another person's rhythm. And that doubt followed me longer than I expected, a lingering ghost, whispering that it was too late to build a real home, that my destiny was to be a well-traveled spectator rather than an active participant in a shared life. Look at me when I say this, because this is where the road I've been talking about finally starts to bend toward you. I didn't just wake up one day completely healed and perfectly whole. I simply chose to stop letting my fear dictate the length of my stride. I decided that it was better to risk being broken by a real connection than to remain perfectly intact inside a tomb of my own making. What if the thing you were chasing wasn't a destination at all, but the capacity to stand still beside someone else without wanting to run? I began to realize that every mile of that long highway, every cold hotel room, and every hollow victory had been a strange, necessary preparation. They had exhausted my ego until there was nothing left to defend, creating an open, quiet space inside me where a true partnership could finally take root. Maybe you felt something similar, that fragile, tentative moment where you decide to lower your shield and trust the world one more time, despite everything you know about how much it can hurt. I didn't know your story yet. I didn't know the paths you had walked or the winters you had survived to reach this same clearing in the forest. But I was finally ready to meet you. I was no longer looking for someone to save me from my past or to validate my future. I was simply looking for a peer, a fellow traveler who knew the cost of the road and still believed in the journey. The old doors inside me were open, the light was left on in the room, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't waiting for a storm. I was waiting for a knock on the door. Everything changes the moment you find yourself recognizing her place in the story. It didn't happen like a lightning strike or a dramatic scene from a movie. It happened with the quiet, undeniable clarity of a missing puzzle piece sliding into place on a random Tuesday. I remember the exact setting, a small, unremarkable coffee shop on a rainy afternoon. The sound of drops tapping against the glass mimicking the rhythm of the highway I had traveled for so many years. You were just sitting there, reading a book, a faint smile playing on your lips, and when you looked up and our eyes met, the rest of the world simply went quiet. In that single, unhurried moment, the chaotic noise of my entire past, the frantic hustle, the lonely hotel rooms, the empty victories, suddenly felt like a distant murmur. I thought I had been searching for a destination. But as I looked at you, I realized I had been looking for a person. It was in the weeks that followed, as we began to share our histories over long walks and quiet dinners, that the true weight of the journey became visible. I listened to you speak about your own winters, the disappointments you had survived, and the ways you had learned to guard your own heart, and I felt a profound, silent reverence. I saw how your strength didn't come from a lack of scars, but from the graceful way you carried them. Have you ever looked at another human being and realized that every mile of the separate, painful roads you both walked was meticulously engineered just to bring you to the exact same intersection at the exact same moment? If I had met you a decade earlier, when I was still intoxicated by my own ambition, I would have ruined it. I would have been too blind to see your value, too busy running to notice that you were the horizon I actually needed. This is the part I rarely talk about, the terrifying realization of how close I came to missing you entirely. If I hadn't stayed in that apartment through the winter of my isolation, if I hadn't forced myself to look at the pattern of my own mistakes, I would have kept driving right past you. I would have viewed your gentleness as a complication and your depth as a threat to my focus. The thought makes my chest tight even now. The image of that younger, arrogant version of myself passing you by in a crowded terminal, completely oblivious to the fact that his entire redemption was sitting just a few feet away. And that realization followed me longer than I expected, transforming into a deep daily gratitude that makes me look at you with a sense of wonder every single morning. Look at me when I say this, because we are standing on the threshold of something I never believed I would deserve. I am not entering this marriage as a perfect man or as someone who has it all figured out. I am coming to you as someone who was broken down by the road, stripped of his illusions, and put back together with a completely different understanding of what matters. I look at you now with our wedding day finally coming into focus, and I don't see a prize or an achievement. I see a sanctuary. I see the partner I didn't know I was praying for when I was sitting alone in the dark, watching the rain streak across my windshield. Maybe you felt that same settling inside your soul, that quiet awareness that the long, exhausting search is finally over. Every unfinished letter I ever wrote was really a letter to you, an attempt to articulate an ache that only your presence could cure. Every long road at night, every missed phone call, and every moment of biting self-doubt wasn't an exile. It was the winding, difficult path that was preparing my hands to hold yours. We have survived our separate storms, my love, and now the clearing is right in front of us. The road hasn't ended, but for the first time in my life, I am not looking at the miles ahead with anxiety. I am looking at them with a smile because I know that whatever the next horizon brings, I will be walking toward it with you. We have finally arrived at the edge of the woods, where the trees thin out and the ground becomes steady beneath our feet. This is the place of peace, redemption, and emotional arrival. The final chapter of a journey that began in the dark and ends here in the clear, honest light of our wedding day. I look at the man I used to be, the one who measured his life in velocity and milestones, and he feels like a character in a book I read a long time ago. He was so busy, so certain, and so incredibly lonely. I don't hate him anymore. I don't carry the shame of his mistakes like a heavy coat into this new room. I see that he had to wander through all those empty hallways and sleep in all those anonymous rooms just to exhaust himself enough to stop fighting the truth. He had to lose his way completely so that he could finally be found by you. I remember watching the sunrise this morning, a quiet dawn that felt entirely different from any other morning I've ever lived through. The air was cool, the city below was silent, and for the first time in my life, there was absolutely no desire to be anywhere else but exactly where I was. I looked at the suit hanging on the door, the rings sitting on the dresser, and I felt a profound, humbling wave of wisdom wash over me. True success isn't something you conquer, it is something you surrender to. It is the ability to stand before another person, completely exposed, without a single title or achievement to hide behind and say, "This is all I am and it is yours." Have you ever realized that the greatest victory you will ever achieve is simply allowing yourself to be truly loved for exactly who you are without the armor? This is the part I rarely talk about, the ultimate realization that the road was never an enemy and it was never a destination. The road was just the teacher. It stripped away my arrogance so that I could learn humility. It broke my heart so that I could understand empathy. And it forced me into isolation so that I would know exactly how to cherish the gift of presence. Every long road at night, every missed phone call, and every light left on in another room was leading to this exact coordinate in time. And that understanding follows me now, not as a regret, but as a deep, unshakable anchor for the future. I am no longer afraid of the storms because I have already survived the worst ones inside myself, and I know the way back to the shelter of your arms. Look at me when I say this, because these are the most important words I will ever offer you. Smile, my love, because the waiting is finally over. The unfinished letters have been answered, the long nights have run out of dark, and the destiny we couldn't see through the fog has finally revealed its face. I am standing here before you, a man who survived his own ambition, who grew through his failures, and who finally found his meaning in the quiet space between your heartbeat and mine. I don't know what lies beyond the horizon of tomorrow, and for the first time, I don't need to control it. The road ahead stretches out before us, vast and unwritten, but it is no longer a lonely path to be conquered by force. It is our shared horizon, a beautiful, sacred space where we get to build a life together, one quiet morning at a time.